You go first, Myisha.
Let me just say, I'm drinking 2 shots of whiskey here. I have never drunk any alcohol before or during a talk. But desperate times calls for desperate measures, let me just say. Now to your question. I think there's something called transitional justice, right? So how do you take an undemocratic society and make it more democratic? How can you take a society that has oppressive citizens and make it more just, right? So that's the transitional justice piece, and something that I'm totally for. Colleen Murphy works on these things, and I'm totally transitional justice is needed. I think that's different from what is often called transitional anger and transformative anger. So Julian mentioned Martha Nussbaum. So Martha Nussbaum has this view that if we are to be angry, the only anger that's really permissible is what she calls transitional anger. It's the anger that you have that you slowly but surely transition out of in order to have more positive emotions. So she thinks there's really no place for anger in public life. And if you are angry, you can be angry for a certain kind of moment, but ultimately that anger ought to transition to love and generosity. I don't believe in that. I believe more in transformative anger. For one, I don't believe in transitional anger in the way in which she describes it, is because, like I said, we said that anger is responding to injustice. So what happens when the injustice is still present? You can't transition out of it. The anger is still apt for the particular situation. But also, if you think about anger in a transitional standpoint, that is to suggest that there's just something wrong with anger by itself. And as I kind of discussed in the first response to Julian's question, is that I think anger is valuable for its own sake. And so it doesn't need any other positive emotions to correct it or to make it beautiful. It is beautiful by itself. I mean, it's beautiful because it proclaims that all lives have value. It's beautiful because it demands justice. It's beautiful because it motivates us to change. We don't need to transition out of it if we don't have to. So I think anger should be transformative in the sense that anger should motivate us to transform our conditions. It should motivate us to do something productive. So that's the kind of anger that I think, if it's apt for the circumstances, that we should utilize it. That we don't need to transition out of anger in order to be useful.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a sort of recurring theme I'm getting in some of your answers is that time and again people are saying emotion is the problem. It's always the case of it's not the emotion per se that's the problem. It's how it's being used. Is it appropriate, etc., etc. And this point you're saying, the Nussbaum argument that anger is something you should transition into a calmer state. I mean, one thing when I was reading her on that struck me was, what of the person who stops being angry and then sort of delivers vengeance cold? All right, is that better? Is that really better? And I'm not sure it is. I mean, I think it's so you can do bad things and ill-considered things totally calmly. And you can do good things with a bit of bubbling anger. It's always about how you're managing it. It's not whether you are feeling emotional or not. It's whether your actions are the right actions and are being informed in the right way. Yeah.
Yeah. I also think that I don't think calm is a good indicator about feeling. I grew up in a household in which my mother was very calm, and it's in those moments that she was very calm that you better watch out because there's always a super anger underneath, right? And so that goes back to like another question that you tried to ask about rationality and anger. Is that we think that if it's fixed up or it looks a certain kind of way that there could be no room for anger there, right? And I want to contrast that because what I'm thinking about is that we think that when politicians get behind to create policies to like disenfranchise people or to dominate people, they're doing that very cold and very calm, and therefore there's no emotion underneath. I reject that view. So the outer appearance can look like something else. It can look calm, it can look excitable, it can look whatever, but that shouldn't be an indicator of the emotion that lies deep there. People who seem cold and calculated, there is ill-being, a lack of goodwill, there's hate, there can be racism, there can be sexism underneath all that calm. So that doesn't make someone more rational because they're calm.
Putin is quite a calm person in public, isn't he? Yeah. Do you anything on transition, Joanna?
Well, I was going to say some of how we talk about these things can make it sound like there's just one thing that a person has at a time. So like you're just angry and that's that for that time, and then you're going to transform. But actually, you have an ecology of environments and you have an ecology of feelings, and I think that the the things that we need to do to create real change, really positive change, you have to work with ecologies. So you need to have spaces that are very generative and joyful and relaxed, and you can hold different types of anger in those spaces, but in a way that is supported. And then in another space you might be just straight up angry. You know, so there might be just different, I guess I'm just pointing to the ecology of...
Yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? I think the example that sprung to head as you were speaking was of like a family example. Parents, I'm not a parent myself, parents are sometimes really angry with their kids, but they're really angry with their kids because, for example, they're really concerned and worried about them. You know, so the kid does something which has put the kid in danger. They're angry, but you've got to understand that that's tied up with deep concern and worry. Whereas there's other times, parents can be angry with their kids in a way which is totally inappropriate, etc. So you say I think the essentially the ecology of the emotions is an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
And I think looking at the kids as well is really important. So you know, often when you look at how kids are behaving, you see what we're really like, and you can kind of de-intellectualize, take a little bit of the theory off of it. And you know, like, so I've got a daughter who is 5 now, and she finds it excruciatingly painful to apologize. So, I mean, we're talking, it's extremely difficult. She needs to find a soft toy that has an ear that she can chew on. You know, a bunch of conditions have to be met before she'll be able to say, sorry. But, you know, there's just a primitive aspect to some of this stuff as well, that it's just about your gears and how your own wiring, and people are varied in that way, so there's a lot of variation.
Very interesting. Okay, we've got on because this hand was first, the third row there towards the wall, and then we'll wait. David, maybe you can just sort of actually find the next person for me, as it were. You take the mic, yeah.
I'd like to ask about the gender dimension to anger. I'm very angry that women especially, their anger is considered emotional, which always means over emotional. I think especially black women's anger is even less sort of acceptable, whereas men's anger is often brave or obviously rational and thus more effective. And I find it quite difficult to know how one's anger as a woman or as girls can be considered at least as effective, and yet own that the emotion that can be behind that, and that's okay. A good thing.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we're talking here about a question of the gender dimension to this, that the female anger is somehow sort of dismissed in a way that male anger isn't. And actually it does relate to broader issues you may or may not want to go into. As one of the things I might have covered in the first half was the whole question about the emotionality itself as being it's gender coded, that, you know, rationality is traditionally seen as more masculine, emotionality more feminine. So feel free to riff off any of these gender dimensions.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you. We have emotions just as being human beings. The ways in which those emotions are taken seriously, or given what we call in philosophy uptake, is very much gendered and racialized. So let me give an example. In society, we have what we call feeling rules, right? So there are rules around emotions, about what is apt or inapt. So for example, we have rules about what you ought to do emotionally at a funeral. And if you obey that rule, then it's like, okay, you fit in. If you violate that rule, then we're like, okay, you're in the wrong place, right? We have emotional rules when it comes to what we ought to do or how we ought to respond at a wedding, right? That's just how we interact. But also, not only that, do we have these general feeling rules, but they also can get very gendered and very racialized, like as you indicated. So we have rules about what kind of emotions a woman can express. So she can express sadness because it's an indicator of her vulnerability, and her ladylikeness, but she can't express anger. Anger is a very masculine trait. So these are the rules that we have. I mean, one of the things that I set up in relationship to anger is that anger is about value and respect, right? So if you believe you have value, then when your value is violated, you would think you have claims to respect. And if you believe that you have claims to respect, you would manifest that through anger, right? If you don't think that you're valuable, then you really won't think that you're disrespected when you're a victim of wrongdoing, and you would not believe that you have claims to anger. So in society, whose lives do we value more? Men. And so when they're violated, we think they have claims to respect and therefore claims to anger. Now here's the thing I think about these kind of rules. They're social rules. We can break these rules. So we break these rules by saying, this is sacred space, so I can't curse. We break these rules by saying...
Sorry, we're outside the sacred space, actually. We're in the extension, so you can swear.
Right?
Yeah.
God, I want to say the F word, but I also feel like I'm in the UK, you guys are very like, forget those rules. Forget those rules, right? I'm gonna be angry at this injustice, this gender injustice.
We're not Bridgerton here, you know.
Oh, let me know. We can say, fuck those rules. Right? Right? I'm gonna feel how I want to feel, right? So we can break those rules as women. Now, mind you, there's going to be consequences for doing so. And that's what happens when we violate kind of sexist, anything that is sexist, anything that is racist. There's consequences to doing that, and that's what makes us a radical when we decide to break those particular rules. But not only can you as a woman break those rules by saying, I'm gonna be angry in spite of, I'm gonna declare my value, even if you don't take me seriously, I'm gonna be angry. But not only can we do that as the person who is angered, we have to make sure, and this is a theme in my work, that as a community, we don't accept these rules as the norm. And a lot of that happens when a woman is angry. What do? How do we respond? Do we immediately dismiss her anger and consider her emotional? And ways in which we don't do with men. So we can break those rules ourselves on the other end. And I think that's a challenge for us all. Yes, we all feel emotions. They are all apt. They're all saying something to us. And the way in which they get read, given our bodies, whether that's our race or our gender, are done in very racist and sexist ways. We can break it as those who are oppressed, but we can also change these rules. And as a society, we have to change it, but also by changing how we receive it, what makes us uncomfortable, changing the kind of social norms. And if we do that, then we can begin to change and make it the case that all people can express their emotions equally.
Thank you. Anything to add to this, Joanna?
Yeah, over the summer at University of Bristol, we had an incident with a security guard. So we're teaching a class, and I won't go into the details, but there was a security guard who was very heavy-handed and intimidating with our students. And it had a racialized dimension. And so I've been going through a grievance process of reporting this as a grievance. When I brought this to different staff members, I had different responses. So from some staff members, I felt very validated, and I was able to express, and they saw the injustice of it. But there were other people who I brought it to, and would have the response that, I'm concerned that you're so upset, and I'm worried about you, and you're very emotional. And they were focusing on that. They were like much more comfortable with highlighting that I was the emotional woman who was vulnerable, as opposed to saying that this was a wrongful act, And so people can, that's an aspect of that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay.
And it's what people, let me just say this because the whiskey's hitting. When people say that, we talk about how emotions is loaded with information. How people receive your anger in that way tells you what they think about you.
Yeah.
It's the greatest gift. It's the greatest gift. Right?
Thanks. Let's do next. So yeah, okay. Let's go to the. You keep an eye on who's first. I'll take. I defer to David when it comes to handing the microphone.
Say choose next one I did. So
Yeah, good. All right, okay. The person opposite at the end, there, gentleman there. Okay, go on.
My apologies first for how this question is going to come out in a very discombobulated way. I've just got lots of thoughts that I want to put into a question. Myisha, you talked about the relationship between oppressors and oppressed, and how those oppressors, will not ever give up power lightly. And I asked this from a professional perspective. One of my professional roles is an educational psychologist, which I guess would be quite similar to the US school psychologist, but we work across many schools. And something that's increased in time in my work is adults referring children to our services for the various emotions they experience because of the climate crisis. And I think I would see children and young people as quite an oppressed group in our societies. And we talked about how those feelings can be around because the issue is still happening. It's not past, it's not gone, it's not being fixed. And I guess I notice in my work that these feelings and these thoughts that children have and the way they express them can often be delegitimized or discounted or discovered. This idea that Anger's not the real emotion, there's other stuff underneath it. And I guess, like, being a practitioner psychologist, I'm more interested in your thoughts about how those of us who think anger is absolutely legitimate and a correct response, how can we combat this delegitimization or discounting of the emotions, the thoughts, and the expressions of that children, for example, might have in the context of something that's making them feel rage, anger, fear, despair, all of those emotions.
Yeah. So I guess again, just sort of frame that. I'm helping our recording here. So I think there's a long history really of emotional reactions being pathologized as being indications that there is something wrong with the individual feeling the feelings, rather than the fact that these are apt responses to situations. An example given is of children who have climate anxiety, and rather than thinking, well, why wouldn't you have climate anxiety? It's thinking, oh, well, this child's got a problem, and maybe it's not the climate anxiety after all. That kind of thing. Maybe it's maybe something's going on in the home or something. Maybe that's suspicion too. How do you sort of deal with this question of the delegitimization of emotions?
Yeah, this goes back to the gender question. I'm glad you asked this. No one has ever asked a question about children in any of my talks. Because in some ways we think that children are infantile, that by definition they don't know what they feel, their brains are not fully developed, and so their judgments are off, and therefore their emotions are off. That is an injustice. We also think the same thing about women and different racial groups, so you can see a similarity here. So the similarity I see in the gender context is, okay, let's dismiss you as emotional so we won't have to deal with the issue or take the issue as serious. And particularly, so we won't have to, give account of what our role is in that situation. And I would say the same thing when it comes to climate anxiety, right? So a lot of young people have a lot of emotions in response to the climate situation. And one of those emotions are anger, and they're angry at us and the generations before us because we haven't done what we were supposed to do. Now, the best way not to take that responsibility or to sidestep that responsibility is to say that, hey, you're not really angry at the climate. You're right. It's to dismiss their emotions so we won't be accountable, right? And so I think the best thing that we can do is two things, and you're more of a practitioner than I am, is to continue to educate parents, increase their emotional intelligence, because even when they leave you, they have to go home, right? So you can build them up, but if they're being built down at home, that's not going to help. That's a hard task. But I will also say, just in your work, you have a unique position to validate. It goes back to what we were saying before. And your validation matters, even if it's for a certain small period of time in their day. But I think that's the challenge for us all. I mean, we've been talking about, at least this is a kind of phenomenon that's popping in the United States about emotional intelligence. And usually the audience for emotional intelligence is adults in relationship to adults. But what happens when we teach our children to improve their emotional intelligence? And what does it mean for us to improve our emotional intelligence in response to our children? So I think a lot of that is just taking accountability, considering children as important judges of their world and valuers of their world, and taking them serious in that respect. And until you do that, you would never take young people's emotions seriously. So it needs to be a radical change in that domain.
Can I just sort of, a slight devil's advocate kind of question though, what about the objection that it's possible to take this too far? That we live in a culture where everyone is entitled to their feelings and to have them validated. And what about the objection, yeah, but sometimes these feelings are inappropriate, sometimes these things need challenging. Sometimes people feel, for example, that they are offended or they are upset by something, and you have to acknowledge they feel that way, but sometimes you perhaps have to challenge them and say, look, or the fact you're offended or insulted, the person who offended or insulted you didn't actually do anything wrong. It doesn't automatically mean that respecting your emotions means respecting the endorsement behind it. So can we, as it were, go too far down the road of saying we must validate people's emotional reactions?
So it's not the validation of the emotional reaction, it's the validation of what that emotional reaction is responding to, right? So one of the things about emotional intelligence is not just, I get to feel all the things, but I have to figure out, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way, right? So it's investigation into one's own emotions. It's not just feeling and not just accepting what you feel, but it's being able to interrogate what one feels. And also is about responding to people by also interrogating how you are responding to them emotionally, right? So it's a lot of reflection going on there. It's not just acceptance. Emotional intelligence is also about reflection, the hard work of reflection. But I'll also say, Julian, you're absolutely right. But what we're talking about is an actual climate issue that is real. So when we're talking about something that is actually real, we got to give attention to that. And there's no nuance behind the matter, right? And they are the inheritance of this situation that we have created. That's very serious. That is not a joke. That is not a myth. That is not something in their mind. That is not something that's going overboard. The issue is serious. Yeah. And so in moments like that, there's nothing to be discussed in that domain, that we need to attend to some of the recommendations that I gave you. But I think you're absolutely right. But I think that's what emotional intelligence is about, and it can cure that.
Just a note, I think the news today was that this year we are set to exceed 1.5 for the first time, I believe.
I agree with everything you've said, and I really like the question. I would just add that it's also really important to empower them to be change makers. So I think creating spaces that validate their feelings and give them a chance to share their feelings with each other, but also teaching them how to make positive steps. So giving them like the experience of doing a small thing, but actually doing it, and then knowing, okay, I set myself a goal, I did the activity I said I was going to do, and now that's complete, and I've done something, and that counted towards, so having that experience of making a small positive change then teaches them not to just stay in those feelings, but to actually learn how to do action that's effective.
Okay, we got the next question coming up. Before you ask it, I just want to give the microphone. There might be some rage in the room because we didn't have enough copies of the Case for Rage, and some people who wanted them couldn't get one. So you costed me. I'm sorry. So if you do want to get it, I just want to encourage you. Don't buy it from the big thing that begins with A and has a Z in the middle. We've got loads of local bookshops in this. You can ring them and they'll have it the next day often. So, and if you do go online, go online the right way.
But and let me also just say there's 2 copies of the forgiveness book. So yes. You might think that the anger book is a little bit more radical than the forgiveness book. But please know that in that book, I'm not telling you to forgive. I'm telling you what to say to people who's making you forgive or making you feel guilty about forgiving. So it's much more radical than you might assume.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. It's the failures of forgiveness, not the kind. Yeah.
Thank you for this event. And so my feeling at the moment is I can't bear to watch television news for an indefinite period of time, 2 days ago. Another feeling is with 72 million people voted for Trump, absolutely convinced that their view of things is right, and they totally isolate themselves from any alternative views or sources of news in quotes. It all seems rather depressing for anyone who cares about justice and the planet and what's the way forward. I'm interested in how to react and what is your approach?
Yeah, so people are feeling, a lot of people, again, not a lot, there are a lot of people actually feeling very happy today about the result, but there are a lot of other people who are feeling depressed. I think depressed is an interesting word actually, very dispirited by what the result means, because it's not just that someone's won, it's telling us that a vast amount of people back it, either because they entirely agree with it or because they think that the downsides are worth paying it. Actually, on the question of forgiveness, a typical comment, I heard one a voter who voted Trump saying, well, what about the fact all these things he said, etc., etc. He goes, well, we're none of us perfect people, and he's not perfect either, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it. But anyway, what guidance? Myisha, help us out here. A lot of people are depressed. Should we just abide in that depression?
I mean, one of the things I want to say is that I woke up this morning and I thought to myself, because I'm a sports fanatic, I should try to recover from this like I try to recover from heartbreaks when it comes to my team losing. I'm trying a variety of strategies, y'all. And myself said, that's not going to work. And I was like, why can't it work? And the self said, because this is not about teams winning and losing. This is about democracy. This is about lives. It's not about my side. It's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of justice. I think those people are on the wrong side of history. And here's the thing, I don't think they want to be on the right side. I don't think that matters to them. The first question is, what do I think? I mean, that's one of the things that I think. And because of that, I mean, that fuels the depression. I mean, I think about 70 million people don't respect me, or not just me, but other people who are susceptible under Trump, and just international foreign, like, so as far as the depression, you know, I would say, as a philosopher of emotion, instead of trying to make yourself transition, be still. And I know positive psychology tells us that, you know, what we ought to be doing is feeling good, but I think we need to be still and feel what we feel and get everything we can get out of that feeling. And then once we finish feeling that way, we reach out for the resources and the fire that we need to do what we need to do, because there's a next, right? So now is the time for grief. Now is the time of mourning. But there is a next. And hopefully when people are done with being still and they're healing themselves from this heartbreak and are ready to tackle their fear, that they have the resources and the strength needed to do just that. But I don't mind, as a person who have written a book about anger and how we need to be fueling, that's not where I am right now. I think where I am right now is I'm in the other negative feelings that doesn't feel good at all. And I'm getting resources, I'm getting knowledge, I'm getting wisdom in this vulnerable state that I'm in. And hopefully in a few days when I fly back, I'll have more courage, more strength to do what's needed to be done to make sure that in the next 4 years we are not victims, but we are victors for justice.
Thank you. One thing before I have about this is that you talked about, you know, being on the side of history, and I sometimes wonder whether or not, you know, sometimes when we're, you know, we think about what we most value in life and we want to be on that side, we like to think we will prevail. And a slightly darker thought is that you don't have to think you're going to prevail. If we don't prevail, there's still a right thing to do. Yeah. I think this is like a theme of some apocalyptic fiction, you know, the world's ending and it's going to die. But in that post-apocalyptic kind of window where last humanity is around, there are the people who do the right thing and there are the people who go out for themselves. So in a way, perhaps it's helpful to kind of, like, as it were, not hold on too much to the, I mean, this is the John Paul Sartre thing, you should live without hope, and not hold on too fast to the idea that, yes, we will definitely prevail, because you could be wrong, but to have the confidence that you're doing the right thing, you're fighting the good fight, and whether you win or not, well, we'll see.
Well, I think there's several fronts to win on, right? So I totally agree with you. It's the fight for me, right? But here's the thing. There's certain victories that I'm in control of, right? So I'm just of the perspective or of the view that no matter who you are, you don't have all the power, right? That there are some things that, yes, you may have power over a policy, but you don't have power over the joy that I woke up with this morning, right? You may have control over who gets deported, but you don't have control over the love that's going to be maintained between those families. That's the front that they can be victorious on. So I think there's several. I want us to encourage us to continue to fight, no matter what area that we're fighting in. There are some fights in which there's no guarantee that we would get victory, and there may be a great probability that we may not. But I just want to remind people that there are some fronts that you can get victory on. And I think what fascists and what oppressors try to do is to make it the case that you will always lose, no matter what. And I just want to remind ourselves that we can be winners. And this is not a Nietzschean revaluation of values here. This is real. That we can win in the multiple areas of our lives that has nothing to do with the power that a powerful leader, or quote unquote powerful leader, has.
I just want to add that, just coming back to that idea that we talked about earlier, about playing the long game, game and seeing the long picture. one thing that I learned through being part of the Countering Colston campaign is that it can seem as if everything is completely stuck. Like there's no chance that anything is going to move. You know, it appeared that there was an immovable wall, you know? And actually, if you're acting intelligently over time, strategically, when the time is right, things can change very quickly and in positive ways. And so I think it just comes back to that thing of being realistic about what we're facing now, but also not feeling that we have to be stuck in that, and just trusting that if we continue to do the right legwork, and I think that a lot of the legwork that's needed is communication, and this is probably less popular and it's kind of harder, but I think there's really is a need for at least human level, like emotional, some kind of levels of communication that are cross-partisan and cross-generational in a way that we're not comfortable or used to right now very much, but we need to be creating spaces where there's some bond, some point of connection being created with people. Like, it doesn't like this. I know a lot of people don't. Where you need to be able to like connect with people who really are politically different, and that is not for everybody, because you might be too traumatized in that time to be able to do that. Some people need to be making those kinds of connections, and there's a need for more intergenerational conversations, because I think that we're going to really struggle to get into a better state if we're just staying in these echo chambers that we're in at the minute.
Okay. Now, if we were a quiz show, we're coming to the time where it'd be the quick fire round. Not going to be quite as whatever, but what I'm going to try and do now is take just a few questions, which I'm going to try and ask the questions to be brief, and we'll try and get the answers to be brief, just so we can get as many more contributions as we can. So, yeah, next.
I wasn't sure if this was actually a question or a statement, but basically what I was going to say is I come from like a long generation of women that were oppressed by men, and in doing so I'm a firm proponent of sacred rage, and within that is that transgenerational trauma that's been passed down to me from all the women that were oppressed. And so I have a 13-year-old and I have a 6-year-old. With my 13-year-old, I have a lot of structure and boundaries, and I look at her now and she's nervous and scared, and she clenches her jaw and won't respond in certain situations, and I realised that I needed to make a change. So with my youngest child, I call her untamable, and I see in her this rage that you can't tame, and I think it's beautiful and really, really sacred. And so I guess it's a statement. How do we feel about allowing children to be rageful, to be in that sacred moment, and to throw their toys out of the pram and not be okay with what we're consoling them with, and allowing them to be angry and creating safe spaces for them, especially black children who come from sort of structure and boundaries and punishment and being beaten by their parents. Like, how do we change the world for the future, for the children, and allow them to be in that sacred range?
I think it happened to me. You jinxed me. I think you're doing just that. I mean, there's a wonderful book called Rage Becomes Her. And in that book, because she's also a parent, she talks about, there's a whole chapter of how kids are educated into thinking emotions are gendered in a certain kind of way. So there's a whole bunch of studies that the author relies on that say at this particular time period, they think they can be freely express their emotions. You get to adolescence, girls and guys are very totally different. But a lot of that is through social education. And so I think a lot of it, what you're talking about, as a parent, you're being intentional about teaching them to be free, because society is going to educate them in a very different way. So we have to be prepared for that. I'm not a parent. There's a whole bunch of studies that's been done that just basically talks about the kind of the work that you're doing. But we can do that, and that's exciting. You are a parent, so.
I love the question, but I really want to learn from what you're doing. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, you're doing it right.
Okay, great. Next up, we got the hands at the back there, and then after that behind.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm just aware that I don't want to leave us out of this collusion. I noticed that the higher you go up the chain of power, the more polite it gets. And how politeness has been weaponized and has controlled how we can be with what is happening, with what is in the room. Yeah, that's probably what I wanted to say, and I could give you examples.
That's an interesting point, actually. Alexandra Tennessini is a philosopher in Swansea. She's written about this and how calls for civility are often actually kind of like coercive ways of like trying to put people back in their place, really. And as you say, it's very easy to be polite and whatever when you're at the top table and you're very powerful. And it's not surprising that people less powerful aren't quite as civil, but then they sort of use that as a way of, well, just be more civil. You both recognise that?
I agree.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Great. The quick fire round is working. And at the back, yeah.
Yeah, so on the point earlier about...
Can't see you.
On the point earlier about like reparation and the need for reparative justice, obviously I think it's quite clear that the world is much kind of more unstable. And the question that I've got really is kind of how can communities, and particularly kind of nations which have been victims of international historical justice, kind of engage constructively with their collective trauma and anger and rage when the perpetrators of that injustice kind of not only are ambivalent about reparations, but might actually even be perpetuating that trauma even still. Kind of on the international stage, how do you approach that kind of internationally between two nations?
Oh, a tiny question. Are we training you to do philosophy or something? Right.
I don't know. Have you got any comment?
Oh, you're throwing it back at me.
Yeah.
You get the human rights. You had the human rights, but you were prepared for this question. This is a huge question, right? I mean, when I'm thinking about nations, let me just say this, which is a way not to answer your question, but pretending to. When I think about nations like Rwanda and I think about nations like South Africa, we have a tendency to think they got their stuff together because people forgave, for example. And what we find out is that the way that these countries look came about because of political projects of reconciliation. And so it took place not just because human beings or neighbors, quote unquote, forgave each other, because not all of them did, but it took place because there were truth and reconciliation committees in which people told the truth. There were reparations. There were amnesty hearings in which people were prosecuted or not. So it's just a reminder that in order for nations to truly heal, there's a variety of political things that must be done in tandem with people's effective attitudinal responses to that particular wrongdoing. Now, what gets tough is that when the injustice is continuing. I think there's no conversation that needs to be had up until this point as far as reconciliation or forgiveness. I think what needs to be covered when there's an injustice going on is to stop the injustice. Mm-hmm. So this, if you kind of think about my book, forgiveness can't happen unless we address what the people are angry about. And until we really deal with the injustice part, there's no way that anyone can move. What conversation are we going to have up to this point? If you still got your foot on my neck and you're asking me to forgive, or you ask me to give me no, I want your foot off my neck. Until that happens, nothing can be done.
Yeah, great, thank you. Time for one quick final question. Do we have it? We do. Yeah. Okay. The hands jumped up, leapt up here. Yeah, I think so. Well, I couldn't see those. He had the most. He had the most assertive hand. One. Okay.
From like an almost revolutionary perspective, how do you arm people or minority groups, and I mean mentally, but also literally, to have anger against the system? Because in a lot of cases, when people or minority groups try and stand up against the system, and the system strikes back, you're almost instantly shut down. So how do you arm people so that they can get angry in the necessary effective way?
Yeah. So I don't think I need to arm people with anger. I think more people are angry than not, particularly when they're victims of injustice. I think the constant challenge is trying to figure out what to do with it. And the results are what they are. I mean, there's people who protest and politicians don't listen to them. And then there's people who organize and some politicians listen to them. And I think for me, and kind of what we've been talking about, it's all about the fight, it's all about the fight, it's all about the fight. And the results will be what they are. But if we keep fighting, I mean, that's just what it's all about. A philosopher by the name of Catherine Norlock calls it perpetual struggle. That there's no guarantee that we're going to live in a utopian society in which there will be no more racism and that there will be no more sexism. That we really have to accept that we're in constant perpetual struggle. And I think the question for all of us, are we going to be on the sidelines, hearkening in despair and depression? Or are we going to be willing to take up the fight and just keep fighting no matter what the results are going to be? And just to go back to something that was said about, what are we going to do with this depression? A point that I made earlier is that the reason why I think that I'm encouraged even in this awful moment is because I just don't think that white supremacy is all powerful. It has a weakness. It has its limits. And I know what the enemy looks like. I know what his weakness is. I know what my strength is, what my community's strength is. And I think that knowledge keeps me going. And not only me, but also other people that are in the fight. And we just need to remember that.
Maybe I'll just have my closing response be to say I draw inspiration from one of the people in the room, Katie Chandler Clark. So hope you don't mind me calling you out, but one thing that Katie said to me that's just massively inspired me is just to understand that huge change can come about through lots of small steps. And so when we're asking these big questions, what do we do about the debt relief? What do we do about really, really big questions? I can't really think at that scale. I think much better about smaller concrete things, and that is protects you against the depression, because you can do them and you can understand that doing lots and lots and just steadily doing lots and lots of things where you choose a target, you accomplish the aim, and you move forward. We can move mountains in that way. And there's also a black feminist thought that we don't have to do everything. Your job is to be one of the grains of sand on the beach. And you just do that. You don't have to do everything.
Thank you both very much. I think it's an interesting discussion. I think it's sort of shown how a lot of the simplistic ways we think about these things aren't the case. That it's been a discussion where there's been lots of emotion, but clearly a lot of very sharp rationality and intellect. We talked about anger, but there's also been a lot of warmth and love, and these things are a lot more complicated than often portrayed, and the negatives and positives of emotions are more difficult to disentangle. Just before I finish, I should say we have two copies of Failures of Forgiveness here left. Snap them up, get them signed. You're not in the UK. When's the last time you were in the UK?
It's been a minute.
Okay, right, exactly. So, she's not, we won't go soon, your last chance to get them signed. As for my books, don't worry about them, but, if you want one, they'll be very kind. As you probably all know, St. George's, we love St. George's. It's like a lot of arts organisations, it's not exactly in the most supportive of climates at the moment, and one thing that keeps it going is its volunteers, and two of the volunteers this evening, Linda and David, have been doing the stewarding for us, so can we just thank them? But finally, thank you all so much for coming. These things only work because people turn up and they listen, they engage, and they ask questions. But of course, they also only work when we manage to get good guests. And I like to put it, it's all my brilliance in choosing them so well. Today's have been fantastic. Myisha Cherry and Joanna Burch-Brown. Thank you so much.